Millfield, Ohio, 1950. The dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that slanted through the bedroom window, catching on the faded baseball pennant tacked above the small wooden desk. Margaret Wilson's fingers trembled as they traced the edge of the neatly made bed, tucking in a corner of the quilt that didn't need straightening. The room smelled of soap and the pine-scented polish she applied weekly to the furniture, never allowing dust to settle, as if keeping the room ready might somehow bring its occupant home. 8-year-olds don't just disappear, she whispered to the empty room, the words worn smooth from repetition over the months. Not in Millfield. Outside, autumn leaves skittered across the front yard, a gust of October wind driving them against the porch steps. The sound startled her. For a heartbeat, she thought it might be footsteps, Thomas's footsteps, but it never was. 5 months had passed since that ordinary Tuesday when Thomas hadn't returned from school. 5 months of police searches, community volunteers combing the woods, dragging the creek, checking abandoned buildings. 5 months of Margaret standing at the window, watching the bend in the road where he should appear, schoolbooks clutched to his chest, the cowlick in his dark hair refusing to stay flat, no matter how she wetted and combed it that morning. The knock at the front door pulled her from her reverie. She smoothed her house dress and made her way downstairs, past the wall of photographs. Thomas missing his front tooth on his 7th birthday, Thomas proudly holding his science project, Thomas and his father before Frank shipped out to Europe and never returned. Sheriff Daniels stood on her porch, hat in hand. His face, weathered from years of small-town police work, sagged with an emotion Margaret recognized immediately. Not hope. Never hope anymore. "Mrs. Wilson," he began, then cleared his throat. "Margaret, we've decided to scale back the active search." The words hung in the air between them, their weight crushing against Margaret's chest. "I see," she managed, her voice hollow. "It doesn't mean we're giving up," he added quickly. "Any new lead, anything at all, we'll be on it right away. But the men have families, jobs." "Of course they do." Margaret's fingers tightened on the doorframe. "Everyone has someone to go home to." Sheriff Daniels shifted his weight, his discomfort evident. "The state police have his information. If there's anything, anywhere in the country—" "Thank you, Sheriff," Margaret cut in, unable to bear his awkward reassurances. "I appreciate everything you've done." After he left, Margaret stood in her living room, the ticking of the mantel clock suddenly deafening in the empty house. Her neighbor Irene had left another casserole on the porch that morning, the community's way of caring for the woman whose tragedy they couldn't fix. She should put it in the icebox. She should eat something. She should do anything other than climb the stairs again and sit in that empty bedroom. Instead, she did what she'd done every day since Thomas vanished. She walked to his desk and opened the small notebook where he'd been practicing his cursive, the careful loops of his name on the top line, the date, May 17th, 1950, the last thing he'd written at home. "I'm not giving up," she told the empty room. "I don't care what they say. Millfield, Ohio, 1955. You should come, Margaret. It would do you good to get out of this house." Irene Patterson arranged cookies on a plate, moving around Margaret's kitchen with the familiarity of someone who had appointed herself caretaker in the 5 years since Thomas disappeared. Her voice was gentle but insistent, the same tone she used when encouraging Margaret to attend church socials, community picnics, or any event that might pull her from her self-imposed isolation. "The school play will be lovely. Betty's daughter is playing the lead." Irene placed the cookie plate on the table. "You used to enjoy the school performances." Margaret didn't respond immediately. Her attention focused on the window where she could see the mail carrier approaching. Each day brought the same foolish surge of hope, though in 5 years no letter had ever arrived with news of Thomas. "I don't think so, Irene." Margaret finally turned from the window. "But thank you for asking." Irene sighed, the sound tinged with familiar exasperation. "Margaret, it's been 5 years. You can't keep living like this." The statement wasn't new. Margaret had heard variations from well-meaning neighbors, from her sister in Cincinnati, who called monthly to suggest Margaret move closer to family, from Dr. Reynolds, who prescribed pills to help her sleep and urged her to find a way forward. What none of them understood was that moving forward meant accepting Thomas was gone forever. And that was the one thing Margaret couldn't do. "I'm managing just fine," Margaret replied, the practiced response automatic. "The sewing work keeps me busy." Indeed, her small living room had become a workspace, the dining table covered with fabric and patterns. Her skilled alterations and dressmaking brought in enough to maintain her modest home, allowing her to reject the repeated offers from her brother-in-law to sell the house and move in with them. Irene's expression softened. "No one expects you to forget him, Margaret. But Thomas wouldn't want—" "Don't!" Margaret's voice hardened. "Don't tell me what my son would want." An uncomfortable silence filled the kitchen until the mail slot clicked and envelopes dropped onto the floor of the entryway. Margaret moved quickly to retrieve them, sorting through bills and advertisements with practiced efficiency, looking for anything unusual. Irene watched her, then gathered her handbag. "I'll leave the cookies. Frank and I are just across the street if you need anything." After Irene left, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, not touching the cookies. Outside, children were walking home from school, their voices carrying through the window. She no longer rushed to look at each dark-haired boy passing by. That particular form of torment had faded after the first year. Instead, she climbed the stairs to Thomas's room, as she did every afternoon. She straightened books that hadn't been moved in years, adjusted the baseball glove on the shelf, and opened the window to let in fresh air. As she turned to leave, she caught her reflection in the small mirror above his dresser. Grey, now threaded through her once auburn hair, lines etched around her eyes from years of searching the horizon. 5 years, she murmured to the empty room. "But I'm still waiting." Millfield, Ohio, 1970. "Mrs. Wilson, we really appreciate you taking this on such short notice." Principal Hargrove held the classroom door open as Margaret entered with her sewing basket. "The pageant is only 3 days away, and when Mrs. Collins broke her wrist, we didn't know where to turn." "Happy to help," Margaret replied, surveying the pile of costumes needing adjustment. After 2 decades of sewing for half the town, her reputation for quick, quality work was well established. At 62, Margaret had reluctantly accepted certain realities. The town no longer whispered about her when she passed. The pitying glances had faded. To most, she was simply the quiet widow who altered clothes and kept to herself. The tragic story of her missing son, relegated to local history, mentioned primarily when newcomers asked about the woman who lived in the old house on Elm Street. Young Mrs. Evans, the third-grade teacher, approached with an apologetic smile. "Some of these might need significant work. The children have grown since measurements were taken." Margaret nodded, already sorting through the costumes. "I'll have them ready by tomorrow afternoon." As she worked, measuring a sleeve against a fidgeting young boy, the classroom door opened. Sheriff Daniels, older now, his hair grey and thinning, stepped inside. His eyes found Margaret immediately. 20 years of practice kept her expression neutral, her hands steady as she continued pinning fabric. Sheriff Daniels had stopped bringing news, real or false, years ago. Now their interactions were limited to polite nods at the grocery store or brief exchanges at community events she occasionally attended. When he approached, however, something in his manner caused her heart to quicken. "Margaret, do you have a moment?" His voice was low, intended only for her. She excused herself from the costume fitting and followed him into the hallway, her mind racing through possibilities. After so many years, she'd trained herself not to hope. Yet the old instinct flared. "What is it, Robert?" She used his first name now, the formality of their early interactions long abandoned. "There's a man asking questions over in Cambridge." Sheriff Daniels referred to the larger town, 30 miles east, about a boy who went missing in the early 50s, showing an old newspaper clipping. Margaret's fingers tightened around the fabric scrap she still held. "What kind of man?" "A reporter of some kind, working on a book about unsolved cases." He studied her face carefully. "I thought you should hear it from me before someone else mentioned it." The momentary spark extinguished as quickly as it had ignited. Another sensation seeker, another ghoulish fascination with tragedy. Every few years, someone would become interested in Thomas's case. a detective passing through, a true crime enthusiast, once even a self-proclaimed psychic who claimed to have visions of where the boy might be found. Nothing ever came of it. Nothing ever changed. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice steady. "If he comes around, I'll send him away." Sheriff Daniels nodded, clearly relieved she wasn't upset. "I told the boys at the station not to give him any information about you, but you know how people talk." After he left, Margaret returned to the classroom, her practice smile firmly in place as she continued fitting costumes. Mrs. Evans chatted amiably about the upcoming spring pageant, oblivious to the storm of memories the sheriff's visit had stirred. That evening, Margaret sat in Thomas's room, the fading light casting long shadows across the meticulously preserved space. The baseball pennant had faded further, the team logo barely visible now. The textbooks on his shelf were outdated relics of another era. Children today learned about moon landings and computers, things Thomas would find fantastical. If he were alive, her son would be 28 years old, a man with a life of his own, perhaps children of his own. Sometimes, rarely, she allowed herself to imagine that life. Thomas grown, successful, happy somewhere. In those fragile moments of fantasy, she told herself perhaps it was better not knowing, better imagining him alive somewhere than confirming the alternative. The reporter never came to her door. Whether Sheriff Daniels had convinced him to leave town, or he'd found more interesting stories elsewhere, Margaret didn't know. Life in Millfield continued its steady rhythm, and she moved within it like a ghost, present but never fully part of the world around her. On the 20th anniversary of Thomas's disappearance, she placed fresh flowers beside his photograph, not on the mantel with Frank's military portrait, but on the small desk in his bedroom where it had always remained. The boy in the black and white image smiled back at her, frozen at 8 years old, a moment captured from a morning in early May 1950, just days before he vanished. "I'm still here," she told him, the words a promise renewed. "I'm still waiting." Millfield, Ohio, 2020. The arthritis in Margaret's hands made sewing difficult now. At 92, she had finally retired her needle and thread, though the old sewing machine remained in the corner of the living room, a relic like so many things in the house that had remained largely unchanged for 7 decades. Millfield had transformed around her. The small downtown now featured a coffee shop where the hardware store once stood. The elementary school Thomas had attended was demolished in the 1990s, replaced by a modern building at the edge of town. Most of her contemporaries were long gone. Irene Patterson had passed 15 years earlier, Sheriff Daniels before that. Now she was cared for by Melissa, a home health aide who visited 3 times a week, a kindly woman in her 50s who helped with cleaning, cooking, and the various medical appointments that punctuated Margaret's quiet existence. "You've got mail," Melissa announced, bringing in an envelope along with the morning coffee. "Looks official." Margaret adjusted her glasses, examining the county letterhead. Inside was a notice about road construction planned for Elm Street, set to begin in the spring. Mundane details of a life that continued its inexorable forward march, even as Margaret herself remained anchored to a single day in May 1950. "Will it bother you, all that noise outside?" Melissa asked, arranging pills in their daily compartments. "I've endured worse," Margaret replied, thinking not of noise but of silence, the silence of a house where a child's laughter should have echoed. After Melissa left, Margaret made her slow way upstairs, one deliberate step at a time, gripping the handrail her nephew had installed during his last visit 5 years ago. The journey was becoming more difficult, but she refused to relocate her bedroom to the ground floor. Moving downstairs would mean no longer visiting Thomas's room each day, a concession she wasn't prepared to make. The room had become something of a time capsule, dust-free thanks to Melissa's diligent cleaning, but otherwise preserved exactly as it had been. The baseball pennant, now protected in a frame to prevent further deterioration. The desk with its notebook still open to Thomas's last handwriting practice. The twin bed with its quilt, refreshed over the years, but matching the original pattern. Margaret eased herself into the small chair by the window, gazing out at the winter landscape. A light snow had begun to fall, coating the street in white. Few children walked to school anymore. Most were driven by parents fearful of the dangers a small town no longer seemed immune to. The world had grown more cautious in the decades since Thomas disappeared. She wondered sometimes what people thought of her. The ancient woman in the old house, keeper of a shrine to a boy gone 70 years. Once the town had pitied her, then gradually forgotten her peculiar grief as new generations arrived with no connection to the tragedy. Now she was simply a curiosity, her story occasionally resurrected when the local historical society gave tours or when the community college journalism students sought human interest stories. The persistent knock at the front door startled her from her thoughts. Margaret rarely received visitors these days. Her nephew called rather than visited, and most of her needs were handled by Melissa. Solicitors typically avoided the house, perhaps deterred by its aged appearance or the local knowledge that an elderly woman lived alone. The knocking continued. With a sigh, Margaret rose and made her slow way downstairs. Through the narrow window beside the door, she could make out the figure of a man, elderly from what she could see, bundled against the January cold. "Who is it?" she called, her hand on the doorknob but not turning it. At her age, caution was warranted. "Mrs. Wilson?" The voice was aged but clear. "Margaret Wilson?" "Yes, that's me." She still didn't open the door. "If you're selling something—" "I'm not selling anything." There was a pause. I have something to tell you. About Thomas." The name spoken by a stranger sent a jolt through her. In recent years, few people mentioned her son by name, as if the passage of time had made the subject taboo. Her fingers, stiff with arthritis, turned the lock and pulled the door open. The man on her porch was indeed elderly, perhaps in his late 70s, his face lined with age, but his posture still relatively straight. He clutched a manila envelope in gloved hands. Behind him, snow continued to fall, dusting his hat and shoulders with white. "Who are you?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The man removed his hat, revealing thinning white hair. His eyes, a deep brown, studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "My name is James Callahan," he said, "but 70 years ago, in this town—" He took a deep breath, his exhale visible in the cold air. 70 years ago, I was Thomas Wilson." Margaret's hand flew to her throat, her breath catching. For 70 years she had imagined this moment in 1,000 different forms, but now that it was here, she found herself speechless. The world seemed to narrow to the man standing on her porch, his face weathered by decades she hadn't witnessed. "That's impossible," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The man, James, offered a sad smile. "May I come in? It's quite cold, and this is a long story." Margaret hesitated, decades of caution warring with the desperate need to hear what he had to say. Finally, she stepped back, allowing him into the home where she had kept vigil for a lifetime. "The kettle's on," she said automatically, the rituals of hospitality taking over where rational thought failed her. "The living room is through there." As James removed his coat and settled into the armchair by the window, Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she prepared 2 cups of tea. Through the doorway she could see him looking around the living room, taking in the photographs on the wall, Thomas at 7, Frank in his uniform, Margaret herself as a young woman. When she returned with the tea tray, he was holding a framed photograph she kept on the side table. Thomas, on his last Christmas before disappearing, proudly displaying a toy fire truck. "I remember this," he said quietly, replacing the frame as she entered. It had a siren that would wind up. The cup rattled against the saucer as Margaret set down the tray. Anyone could know that. It was in the newspaper articles. James nodded, accepting the challenge in her statement. Of course, just as anyone could research that Thomas Wilson disappeared walking home from Millfield Elementary on Tuesday, May 17, 1950, that he was wearing a blue sweater his mother had knitted and carrying a science project about the solar system. He paused, watching her face. But would the newspapers mention that he had a scar on his right knee from falling out of the apple tree in the backyard, or that he kept a jar of marbles under his bed with a special blue cat's eye he considered lucky? Margaret sank slowly into the chair opposite him, her legs no longer able to support her. Those details had never been published. The scar, yes, as part of the description circulated by police, but not the story behind it. And the marbles had been their secret, a collection Thomas had been building despite Frank's insistence that such things were a waste of money. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice stronger now, edged with a mixture of hope and suspicion that had become her constant companions through the decades. James opened the manila envelope he'd brought and carefully extracted a faded photograph, a school portrait of Thomas that Margaret recognized immediately. She had distributed dozens of them during the search. "I've carried this my whole life," he said, "even when I couldn't remember why." "What do you mean, couldn't remember?" Margaret's hands clutched the teacup, seeking its warmth as a chill settled over her. James took a deep breath. "Mrs. Wilson, Margaret, what I'm about to tell you will sound incredible, but I swear to you it's the truth as I've pieced it together." He leaned forward, his eyes, so familiar yet changed by time, holding hers. "I don't remember being Thomas Wilson. Not really. My earliest clear memories begin around age 9, living with a couple named Callahan in Pittsburgh." Margaret's breath caught. Pittsburgh was only about 100 miles away, close enough to transport a child quickly, far enough to hide him in plain sight. "Robert and Elaine Callahan told everyone I was their nephew," James continued. "That my parents had died in a car accident and they had taken me in. I believed them, why wouldn't I? But there were gaps, nightmares, a feeling of displacement I couldn't explain." Outside, the snow continued to fall, casting the living room in a muted grey light. Margaret remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I had no memories from before I came to them. The doctors called it trauma-induced amnesia, said it might clear up eventually, but it never did." He paused, sipping his tea. "The Callahans were kind in their way, strict, but not cruel. They gave me a good home, education. Robert worked for the railroad, and Elaine kept house." But if what you're saying is true," Margaret interrupted, unable to keep silent any longer, "then they kidnapped you. They stole my son." The anger that welled up surprised her with its intensity, not dimmed by 70 years, but preserved like everything else in this house. James's expression grew troubled. "It's more complicated than that. The truth took me decades to uncover, and I'm still not sure I have all of it." He shifted in his seat, wincing slightly at what Margaret assumed was the same arthritis that plagued her own joints. "Robert Callahan was Frank's younger brother," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, impossible yet somehow making a terrible kind of sense. Margaret's mind raced back through memories, Frank mentioning a brother once or twice, but they weren't close. He'd never visited Millfield, not that she recalled, had never even attended their wedding. "That's not possible," she said, though uncertainty had crept into her voice. "Frank didn't, he never said—" "They had a falling out before the war," James explained. "I've seen the letters. Robert blamed Frank for taking his place in the family business, forcing him to find work elsewhere. When Frank died in the war, Robert felt cheated out of a reconciliation." Margaret shook her head, trying to process this new information. "So you're saying Frank's brother, a man I never met, took my son out of, what, revenge? Spite?" "Not exactly," James said, his voice gentle. "From what I've been able to piece together, Robert came to Millfield in early 1950, intending to reconnect with his brother's widow and nephew. But when he arrived, he found you struggling, a single mother working multiple jobs, leaving Thomas alone often." The accusation stung, though Margaret knew there was truth in it. Those first years after Frank died had been desperately difficult. Before taking up sewing full-time, she'd worked at the diner and done cleaning jobs, leaving Thomas with neighbors when she could, but alone more than she cared to admit. "Robert convinced himself he could give Thomas a better life," James continued. "He and Elaine couldn't have children of their own. In his mind, he was rescuing his nephew, not stealing him. That wasn't his decision to make, Margaret's voice cracked. He had no right. No, James agreed. He didn't. A heavy silence filled the room. Margaret's mind whirled with questions, with rage, with a terrible sense of time irretrievably lost. How did you find out, she finally asked, if you didn't remember? James set down his teacup and reached again into the manila envelope, extracting a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. After Elaine died in 1987, Robert became ill, cancer. Near the end, he gave me these. Letters from Frank during the war, a few photographs. He hesitated, and a confession, not the whole story, but enough to start me searching. Margaret's eyes fixed on the bundle of letters, Frank's handwriting visible on the exposed edge of one envelope. Her throat tightened. By then, I was nearly 50 with a family of my own. My whole identity built around being James Callahan. His voice grew rough with emotion. It took me years to accept what he'd told me, even longer to decide what to do about it. 33 years, Margaret said, the mathematical calculation automatic. You've known for 33 years and only come now? The accusation hung between them, sharp-edged and painful. James's face creased with remorse. I was a coward. At first I told myself I was protecting my children from scandal, my wife from upheaval. Later I convinced myself it was too late, that finding out the truth would only cause more pain. He met her gaze directly. But those were excuses. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of what? Margaret asked, though she thought she knew the answer. Afraid that the life I remembered, the only life I knew, was built on a terrible wrong. Afraid of what that meant about the people who raised me. He looked down at his weathered hands. And afraid to face you, to see the grief I now know you've carried all these years. Margaret rose shakily from her chair and moved to the window, needing distance, needing air. Outside, the snow had begun to accumulate on the sidewalk, covering the footprints James had left when he arrived. I have a right to be angry, she said finally, her back still to him. 70 years, Mr. Callahan. 70 years wondering if my son was alive or dead. 70 years preserving a room for a boy who was living another life 100 miles away. Yes, he agreed simply. You have every right. She turned back to face him, studying the stranger who claimed to be her son. There was nothing of Thomas in his features. How could there be? The boy she'd lost had been 8 years old, his face still rounded with childhood. This man before her had lived a lifetime she knew nothing about, his face mapped with experiences she hadn't witnessed. And yet, something in the set of his eyes, the gesture he made when pushing back his thinning hair. Could she see Frank there? Or was she simply desperate to believe? Do you have proof? She asked. Beyond these stories and coincidences. James nodded, reaching once more into the envelope. I thought you might ask that. I've brought medical records. The scar on the right knee is documented, and this... He withdrew a small velvet pouch and emptied it into his palm. A blue cat's eye marble gleamed against his skin. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, a small sound escaping her. Robert took it with us that day, James explained. Said I was clutching it in my pocket when he took me. For the first time since he'd arrived, Margaret allowed herself to consider the possibility that this man truly was her Thomas. The implications were overwhelming. If he was telling the truth, then her son had been alive all these years, just out of reach, growing up, going to school, perhaps marrying and having children of his own, grandchildren she had never known. Do you have a family? She asked abruptly. James seemed surprised by the question but nodded. A wife, Caroline. We've been married 48 years. 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Susan. 5 grandchildren. He hesitated, then added, They don't know I'm here. I thought this should be between us first. 48 years, Margaret repeated, the number striking her. Nearly half a century of marriage that she knew nothing about. Daughters she had never met. And what did you do? Your work, I mean. I taught high school science, he replied. Physics mainly. Retired in 2005. A science teacher. Thomas had loved his science classes, had proudly brought home his solar system project just days before he disappeared. Another piece that fit. another thread connecting this stranger to her lost boy. "I need to know everything," Margaret said, returning to her chair. "If you are my Thomas, and I'm not saying I believe you yet, then I've missed a lifetime. I need to know about the man my son became." James nodded, his expression solemn. "I understand. But first, there's something else you should know." He hesitated, seeming to gather his courage. "Robert Callahan isn't the only one who came to Millfield that day. He didn't act alone." The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 3 as James continued his account, filling in the decades Margaret had lost. His childhood in Pittsburgh, adjusting to a new name and identity. The nightmares that plagued him throughout his youth. Dreams of running down an unfamiliar street, someone calling a name he couldn't quite hear. "I was a quiet child," he explained. "Studious, serious. The Callahans encouraged education, but were reserved with affection. I always felt there was something missing, a connection I couldn't name." He described his teenage years, his growing interest in science, the college scholarship that sent him to Penn State, meeting Caroline in his junior year, their courtship and marriage soon after graduation. "I got my teaching certificate and started at Roosevelt High in Pittsburgh in '68, he continued. "We bought a small house in the suburbs. Elizabeth was born in '73, Susan in '75. Each milestone, he recounted, was another moment lost to Margaret, another birthday not celebrated, another achievement she hadn't witnessed. The weight of these absences pressed against her chest, making it difficult to breathe. "When the girls were young," James said, "I would sometimes catch myself staring at them, trying to remember something just beyond reach. Elizabeth has had your auburn hair." The use of past tense wasn't lost on Margaret. "She's grey now too, I suppose." "Salt and pepper," James confirmed with a small smile. "She says she earned everyone." As the afternoon wore on, the snow outside thickened, casting the living room in a premature twilight. Margaret turned on the lamp beside her, its warm glow creating a small island of light between them. "You still haven't told me who helped Robert take you," she said, returning to the question that had been lurking throughout his recounting. James's expression grew grave. "No, I haven't." He glanced toward the window, where darkness had begun to fall. "Because it involves people who are still in Millfield, people whose lives would be destroyed by the revelation." Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. Who in this town could have been complicit in such a terrible act? Who had watched her suffer for decades while knowing the truth? "I deserve to know," she insisted. "You do," James agreed. "But I've learned that truth and justice aren't always compatible with mercy." He leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "Before I tell you, I need to know what you intend to do with this information." Margaret bristled at the implied challenge. "That's not for you to decide. If someone helped steal my child, someone who believed they were saving a child from neglect," James interjected gently, "someone who has lived with their choice for 70 years, the suggestion that she had somehow been at fault, that Thomas had needed saving from her, rekindled Margaret's anger. You were not neglected. You were loved. Every single day you were gone, you were loved and missed and searched for." To her surprise, James's eyes filled with tears. "I believe you," he said quietly, "and I'm so sorry for what you endured, more than I can express." The simple acknowledgement, the first real recognition of her suffering in 70 years, broke something loose inside Margaret. A sob escaped her, then another. Emotions she had held in strict control for decades, suddenly overwhelming her defenses. James moved to kneel awkwardly beside her chair, his own body betraying the limitations of age. He tentatively reached for her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she allowed him to take it. "I don't know if I can forgive," she said when she could speak again. "I don't know if I want to." "I understand," he replied, "but before you decide, there's something you should see." James reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small leather wallet. From it, he carefully extracted a photograph, recent, judging by the quality, of a family grouped on a porch. An older couple, James and presumably his wife Caroline, surrounded by middle-aged women, young adults, and several children. "This was taken last Thanksgiving," he explained. My family. Your family too, if you want them to be. Margaret took the photograph with trembling fingers, studying the faces of strangers who might be her blood. A young boy, perhaps 10 or 11, stood in the front row, his smile revealing a gap where front teeth should be, so similar to Thomas's smile in the photographs on her wall that it took her breath away. "That's Christopher," James said, following her gaze. "Elizabeth's youngest. He wants to be an astronaut." Margaret traced the boy's face with her fingertip, imagining another life where she would have known him from birth, would have held him as a baby, and watched him grow. "There's something else I should tell you," James said, his voice growing serious again, "about why I've finally come forward after all these years." She looked up from the photograph, noting the shadow that had crossed his face. "I'm ill," he said simply. "Pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less." Margaret felt an unexpected surge of grief to find her son after 70 years, only to lose him again so soon. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "I'm sorry," she said, the words inadequate for the complexity of emotions swirling within her. "Don't be," he replied with a sad smile. "I've had a good life. But I couldn't leave this world without trying to make this right, without giving you the answers you've waited so long for." Outside, the streetlights had come on, their glow reflecting off the snow-covered ground. The house had grown chilly as the afternoon waned into evening, but neither of them moved to adjust the thermostat. "Who helped Robert take you?" Margaret asked again, her voice steady now. "I need to know." James sighed deeply, the sound carrying the weight of his reluctance. "It was Sheriff Daniels," he said at last, "and Dr. Reynolds." Margaret stared at him, disbelief warring with a terrible sense of betrayal. Sheriff Daniels, who had led the search, who had visited her monthly that first year with updates that never contained real news. And Dr. Reynolds, who had prescribed her sleeping pills, who had gently suggested she move on with her life. "That's not possible," she whispered, though even as she spoke pieces were falling into place. The search that never quite extended in the right direction. The subtle pressure to accept that Thomas was gone forever. "Robert paid them," James continued, his voice flat. "Not much by today's standards, but significant in 1950. They helped create a story about a drifter seen near the school, fabricated evidence that led the search away from the truth. By the time anyone might have thought to investigate Robert, a relative no one in town knew about, he was back in Pittsburgh, and I was installed as his nephew with a new name and identity. The betrayal was staggering. For 70 years, she had believed the community had rallied around her, had shared in her grief and search. To learn that the very men she had trusted most had orchestrated her loss was almost too much to bear. "Sheriff Daniels came to my house every month that first year," she said, her voice hollow. "He sat at my kitchen table and promised he wouldn't give up looking. I believe he regretted his part in it," James offered. "From the letters I found, he tried to back out several times, but by then he was committed, implicated." "And Dr. Reynolds?" James hesitated. "He convinced himself it was for the best, that you weren't stable enough after Frank's death to raise a child alone." The judgment, carried across 7 decades, struck Margaret like a physical blow. "He had no right," she repeated, the words a mantra against injustice too large to fully comprehend. "No," James agreed, "he didn't." They sat in silence for several minutes, each absorbed in private reckonings with the past. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "They're both gone now. What good does knowing do me?" "Do perhaps none," James admitted. "Except that it's the truth, and I thought you deserved that, at least." Margaret nodded slowly, her gaze returning to the family photograph she still held. "And this? What am I to do with this truth? These people who don't know me, who have no reason to welcome a stranger into their lives?" "That's up to you," James said, "and to them. I've told Caroline about you, not everything, not yet, but she knows I've come here today, knows what I hope might be possible. Which is that before I die, I might bring together the 2 halves of my life, that my children and grandchildren might know you and you them." He paused. "That whatever time I have left might help heal some small portion of the damage done 70 years ago." Margaret studied his face, this stranger who claimed to be her son, who carried a blue marble and remembered a toy fire truck with a wind-up siren. Who knew about the scar on Thomas's knee and the apple tree in the backyard? "I'll need time," she said finally, "to process all of this, to decide what I believe." "Of course," he agreed, rising stiffly to his feet. "I'm staying at the Millfield Inn through the weekend. After that, I'll need to return to Pittsburgh for treatment." He withdrew a business card and placed it on the side table. "My number. If you're ready to talk again." As he gathered his coat and prepared to leave, Margaret remained seated, overwhelmed by the revelations of the afternoon. At the door, James paused, turning back to face her. "Whether or not you choose to believe me," he said quietly, "I want you to know something. The boy you lost, he was loved. He grew up to be a man who tried to do good in the world. He had a family who cherished him, students who respected him." His voice faltered. "If there's any comfort in that, I hope you'll take it." With that, he opened the door and stepped out into the snowy evening, leaving Margaret alone with a lifetime of questions finally answered, and a new set of impossible choices to make. Sleep eluded Margaret that night. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling as snow continued to fall outside her window, coating Millfield in silence. James's revelations played through her mind like a film reel, stuck on repeat. Thomas alive all these years, raised by Frank's brother, Sheriff Daniels, and Dr. Reynolds, complicit in the deception. The blue marble sat on her nightstand where she'd placed it after James left. She hadn't been able to bring herself to put it in Thomas's room, not yet, not until she was certain. Could she be certain? After 70 years, what proof could possibly exist that would conclusively confirm or deny James's claims? As dawn broke, casting pale light through her curtains, Margaret made a decision. She wouldn't simply take James's word, not when the truth mattered this much. She would investigate on her own, use what resources she had to verify his story before deciding whether to welcome him, and by extension, his family, into her life. With new purpose, Margaret rose and dressed with greater care than usual, selecting a navy dress she normally reserved for church, rather than her everyday house dress. If she was going to conduct an investigation, she would do it properly. Her first call was to Melissa, the home health aide, asking her to come earlier than her scheduled afternoon visit. Her second was to the Millfield Inn, leaving a message for James Callahan that she would be in touch, but needed time. By 9 o'clock, Melissa had arrived, concern evident on her face, as Margaret explained she needed transportation to the county records office in Cambridge. Today, in this weather? Melissa glanced out the window at the snow-covered street. "Mrs. Wilson, the roads might not be fully cleared yet. It's important," Margaret insisted, her tone brooking no argument. "If you can't take me, I'll call a taxi." Recognizing the determination in her elderly client's manner, Melissa relented. "Let me check the road conditions first, and you'll need to bundle up. It's freezing out there." An hour later, they were making the careful drive to Cambridge, Margaret clutching a leather portfolio containing the few documents she'd kept related to Thomas's disappearance. The county seat housed records going back to the town's founding, birth certificates, death records, property transactions. If there was evidence to corroborate or disprove James's story, she might find it there. "Do you want to tell me what this is about?" Melissa asked as they drove, her curiosity finally getting the better of her professional discretion. Margaret considered the question. She had told no one about James's visit, unsure whether she believed his claims herself, but she needed an ally, someone to help her navigate what might be a difficult truth. "A man came to see me yesterday," she began, choosing her words carefully. "He claims to be Thomas." Melissa's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her surprise evident. "Your son, the one who disappeared in 1950? "Yes." Margaret gazed out at the snow-covered landscape passing by. "He says Frank's brother took him, gave him a new identity in Pittsburgh. Do you believe him?" Melissa's voice was gentle, careful. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. That's why we're going to Cambridge. I need to see what records exist about Frank's family, about the investigation. The county records office was housed in a stately brick building near the courthouse. Despite Melissa's concerns about Margaret navigating the slippery walkway, the older woman moved with surprising determination, her cane finding purchase on the cleared path. Inside, a middle-aged clerk looked up with mild surprise as they entered. Visitors were clearly uncommon on snowy January days. "May I help you?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. "I need to see records from Millfield Township," Margaret stated, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "Specifically, police reports from May 1950 and any birth or marriage records related to the Wilson or Callahan families." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite specific. May I ask what this is regarding?" "A cold case," Margaret replied, straightening to her full height despite the arthritis in her spine. "My son's kidnapping." Something in Margaret's demeanor, perhaps the steel in her voice or the unwavering certainty in her gaze, convinced the clerk not to ask further questions. With a nod, she led them to a research room and promised to retrieve the requested files. While they waited, Melissa touched Margaret's arm gently. "Mrs. Wilson, are you sure you want to do this? After all these years?" "I've spent 70 years waiting for answers," Margaret replied. "I won't turn away from them now, no matter how painful they might be." When the clerk returned, she wheeled in a cart containing several boxes of files and a large ledger book. "These are the police records from 1950-1951, she explained, indicating the boxes. "And this is the birth and marriage registry for Millfield Township from 1900 to 1960. For the next several hours, Margaret and Melissa meticulously combed through the records. The police reports on Thomas's disappearance were familiar to Margaret. She had read them many times in the months after he vanished. But now, armed with James's revelations, she scrutinized them for inconsistencies, for signs that Sheriff Daniels had deliberately misdirected the investigation. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a report dated May 20th, 1950. 3 days after Thomas disappeared, Sheriff Daniels reports interviewing a transient worker who was seen near the school. The report says they searched the abandoned Miller farm based on this lead. She tapped the paper. "But there's no name for this witness, no description of the transient." Melissa leaned closer. "Could be sloppy police work. Or fabrication," Margaret said grimly. "James said they created a false lead to direct attention away from Robert Callahan." Indeed, the marriage records yielded more concrete evidence. There, in flowing script, was the record of Frank Wilson's parents, Arthur and Emma Wilson, with their children listed in the margin. Frank, born 1915, and Robert, born 1917. "So Robert Wilson existed," Melissa observed. "That part checks out." Margaret nodded, her finger tracing the faded ink. "Frank never talked much about his family. They had some falling out before we met. I knew he had a brother, but I never met him." Further searching revealed Robert Wilson's marriage to Elaine Crawford in 1938 in Pittsburgh, a record included in the Millfield archives because Robert's birthplace was listed. After that, the trail went cold. There was no record of Robert and Elaine adopting a child, no indication they had ever returned to Millfield. By mid-afternoon, Margaret's energy was flagging, the emotional and physical toll of the day catching up with her. Melissa gently suggested they continue their search another day, but Margaret insisted on one final request. "Death certificates," she said. "For Robert and Elaine Callahan of Pittsburgh." The clerk had to make several calls to locate these records, as they weren't housed in the Millfield archives. Eventually, she returned with photocopies obtained from Allegheny County. Robert Callahan, formerly Wilson, had died in 1988, cause of death listed as pancreatic cancer. Elaine had preceded him in 1987, heart failure. Their address matched the Pittsburgh neighborhood James had mentioned. Margaret sat back in her chair, emotions warring within her. The evidence supported James's story, at least the bare framework of it. Frank had indeed had a brother named Robert, who had moved to Pittsburgh and married a woman named Elaine. They had lived in the neighborhood James described. Robert had died of the same cancer James claimed was now taking his own life. But none of this definitively proved that James was Thomas. For that, she needed something more concrete. DNA testing, Melissa suggested as they drove back to Millfield in the fading afternoon light. It's much more accessible now. If he's really your son, a DNA test would prove it. Margaret nodded slowly. The thought had occurred to her as well, though the idea of such modern scientific methods seemed foreign to her. But Melissa was right. If James was willing, a DNA test could provide the certainty she craved. As they pulled up to her house, Margaret noticed a car parked across the street, unfamiliar with rental plates. A woman sat inside, watching the house with evident interest. "I wonder who that is," Melissa murmured, following Margaret's gaze. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "that may be Caroline Callahan." The woman from the car approached as Margaret and Melissa made their way up the walkway to the porch. She was in her 70s, with silver hair cut in a stylish bob and a wool coat buttoned against the cold. Her face, lined with age but still handsome, bore an expression of nervous determination. "Mrs. Wilson," she called. "Margaret Wilson." Margaret paused, leaning slightly on Melissa's arm. "Yes?" The woman climbed the few steps to the porch, her movements betraying the same stiffness that plagued Margaret's own joints. "I'm Caroline Callahan, James's wife." She extended her hand. "I hope you don't mind me coming. James told me he'd visited you yesterday." Margaret hesitated only briefly before accepting the outstretched hand. "I was just thinking about contacting your husband," she said. "Please, come in out of the cold." Inside, Margaret asked Melissa to prepare tea while she showed Caroline to the living room. The two women regarded each other with mutual curiosity, connected by a man who might be Margaret's long-lost son, and was certainly Caroline's husband of nearly 5 decades. "James doesn't know I'm here," Caroline admitted once they were seated. "He'd probably be upset with me for interfering, but when he came back to the hotel yesterday—" She paused, searching for words. "I've never seen him so affected, so raw." Margaret studied the woman before her, this stranger who had shared a life with the man who might be Thomas. "How much do you know about what happened in 1950? "Not everything. Not until recently," Caroline replied. "James always knew he was adopted in a sense. The Callahans never hid that they were his aunt and uncle who took him in after his parents died, or so the story went." She smoothed her skirt, a nervous gesture. "But there were always gaps, things that didn't quite add up." "Such as?" Margaret prompted. "No photographs before age 9, no details about his supposed parents and the nightmares." Caroline's expression grew troubled. "All his life, he's had these terrible dreams, running down a street, someone calling a name he can't quite hear." The detail matched what James had told her, Margaret noted. Either they had coordinated their stories very carefully, or they were telling the truth. "When did you learn the full story?" she asked. "After Robert died in 88, Caroline said. "James found letters, documents. It took him years to piece it all together, tracking down newspaper articles about a missing boy in Millfield, connecting his few fragmented memories with the details in those articles." She leaned forward. When he finally realized the truth, it nearly broke him. The people who raised him, who he'd loved and respected, had committed this terrible act. Melissa entered with the tea tray, setting it on the coffee table before discreetly withdrawing to the kitchen. Margaret poured for both of them, the familiar ritual giving her time to process Caroline's words. "If he discovered this decades ago," Margaret said finally, "why come forward only now?" Caroline's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Fear at first, then shame, and finally a misguided desire to protect everyone. You from the pain of learning how you'd been betrayed, his daughters from discovering their family history was built on a lie. She paused. "But when he got the diagnosis 3 months ago, something changed. He said he couldn't die with this truth still buried." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup. "The cancer. Is it really as serious as he said?" "Stage 4, Caroline confirmed, her voice catching. "It's spread to his liver. The doctors give him 6 months, but—" She shook her head. I think it will be sooner. A strange, contradictory grief washed over Margaret, mourning a son she'd just found, who would soon be lost again, if he was her son at all. I want to believe him, Margaret said quietly. But after 70 years, how can I be certain? Caroline reached into her handbag and withdrew a small plastic bag containing what looked like a hairbrush. That's why I'm here, she said. James mentioned you might want proof. This is his hairbrush. There should be enough for a DNA test. Margaret stared at the offered item, momentarily speechless. Either these people were executing an elaborate deception, for what purpose she couldn't imagine, or they truly believed James was Thomas and wanted to prove it to her. There's something else, Caroline added, setting the brush on the table between them. She withdrew a manila envelope similar to the one James had brought. James has been researching what happened for years. He's collected evidence, testimonies, things he thought you should know, whether or not you accept him as your son. Margaret accepted the envelope with a strange sense of déjà vu. What kind of evidence? About the people involved in Thomas's disappearance, not just Robert and Sheriff Daniels. Caroline hesitated. There were others, people still living in Millfield. The idea that others in town might have known, might have watched her grief for decades while keeping their silence, sent a chill through Margaret. Who? It's all in there. Caroline nodded toward the envelope. Names, dates, what James has been able to piece together. He wanted you to decide what to do with the information. Margaret set the envelope aside, unwilling to open it while Caroline watched. Whatever revelations it contained would have to wait until she was alone. May I ask you something personal? She said instead. Caroline nodded. What kind of man is he? James. The question that had haunted her for decades, what had become of her boy, now had a living answer sitting across town in a hotel room. A soft smile transformed Caroline's face, erasing years of worry. He's the kindest man I've ever known, thoughtful, deliberate. He believes problems should be approached methodically. The science teacher in him, I suppose. Her expression grew fond. He's devoted to our daughters, absolutely besotted with the grandchildren. He coached Little League Baseball for years, though he claimed not to care much for sports. The description conjured an image so different from the 8-year-old boy Margaret remembered that it was difficult to reconcile them as the same person. Yet something about it resonated. Thomas had been a serious child, methodical in his own way, arranging his marbles by size and color, carefully labeling his school notebooks. He has Frank's laugh, Margaret said suddenly, the memory surfacing from nowhere. Thomas did. When he found something truly funny, he would laugh just like his father, this surprise sound, like he couldn't believe something could be that amusing. Caroline's eyes widened. James does that exact thing. The girls used to imitate him when they were teenagers, this sort of startled ha-ha when something catches him off guard. The shared observation hung between them, a small but significant connection. Will you see him again? Caroline asked after a moment. Before we leave on Sunday? Margaret considered the question. Part of her wanted to wait for the DNA results, to have scientific certainty before investing more emotion in this reunion. But another part, the part that had kept vigil for 70 years, couldn't bear to waste even a day if James truly was her Thomas. Yes, she decided. Tomorrow, perhaps, after I've had time to review these materials. She gestured to the envelope. Relief washed over Caroline's features. Thank you. Whatever you decide about the past, about what was done, I think meeting you will give James peace in his final months. As Caroline prepared to leave, she paused at the door. There's one more thing, she said, turning back. The grandchildren. They don't know any of this yet. James wanted to meet you first, to be sure before involving them. Of course, Margaret agreed. This is complicated enough without bringing children into it prematurely. Caroline smiled gratefully. James said you'd understand. She hesitated, then stepped forward and embraced Margaret briefly. Thank you for seeing me, for being willing to consider all this after so long. After Caroline left, Margaret returned to the living room where Melissa waited, curiosity evident on her face. That was his wife, Melissa asked. What did she want? Margaret showed her the hairbrush and the envelope. Evidence, she said simply. And to plead his case, I think. Are you going to do the DNA test? Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, but first I need to see what's in here. She tapped the envelope. Will you stay a bit longer? I might need support. Melissa immediately agreed, and together they settled on the sofa as Margaret carefully opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of documents, photocopies of letters, newspaper clippings, what appeared to be journal entries, and several typed pages that seemed to be James's own narrative of his investigation. Where should we start? Melissa asked, surveying the materials spread across the coffee table. Margaret selected a typed sheet labeled Participants at the top. Here, she said. Let's see who else was involved in taking my son. The list was longer than she had expected. Sheriff Daniels and Dr. Reynolds, whom James had already named, but also Martin Fletcher, who had owned the town's only taxi service in 1950. Apparently, he had driven Robert and Thomas to the bus station in Cambridge, knowing full well who they were and that something was amiss. And June Simmons, a nurse at the county hospital who had provided falsified medical records indicating Thomas had been examined there the week before his disappearance, records that were used to establish the Callahans' guardianship in Pittsburgh. Most shocking was the inclusion of Irene Patterson, Margaret's neighbor, her self-appointed caretaker in the years following Thomas's disappearance. According to James's notes, Irene had been the one to suggest to Robert that Thomas would be better off with his uncle, had helped create the opportunity for Robert to take the boy by inviting Margaret to assist with a church function that afternoon. Irene, Margaret whispered, the betrayal cutting deeper than she could have imagined. All those years she brought casseroles, sat at my kitchen table. Melissa placed a comforting hand on Margaret's arm. Are you sure this is accurate? It seems incredible that so many people could keep such a secret. Small towns have their own logic, Margaret replied, her voice distant. And in 1950, a widow struggling to raise a son alone. Perhaps they convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. They continued through the documents, piecing together a narrative that spanned decades. Robert's initial visit to Millfield, ostensibly to reconnect with his late brother's family. The conspiracy that formed when he decided Thomas would be better off with him and Elaine. The careful extraction of the boy from his life, the deliberate misdirection of the subsequent investigation. Most disturbing were the excerpts from Robert's journal, written during his final illness and given to James, along with his confession. In them, Robert expressed regret, but also a stubborn conviction that he had done the right thing, that Thomas had flourished under his care in ways he never would have in Millfield with Margaret. I gave the boy opportunities Frank would have wanted for him, Robert had written. A good education, stability, a future beyond this backwards town. If Margaret had been a better mother, a more attentive one, perhaps things would have been different. The judgment,